zone, which was notoriously malarious for many, many years, which is why it took so long for us to build the Panama Canal. There's at least 3 civilizations that attempted it. The Spanish tried first, and they gave up. Then the Scots tried in the 1600s, and I think half of them fell sick with different kinds of fevers and went home with their tails between their legs. And finally, the French tried. Hundreds of thousands of workers died of malaria and yellow fever. And then finally, the U.S. military engineers succeeded in building the Panama Canal. So it was notoriously malarious place. But now, if you go to the Panama Canal zone, you don't need to take any prophylaxis for malaria. It's gone. There's there's malaria along the edges, but you don't need to take anything if you go to that one strip of land deep in malaria territory. So this is supposed to be a tropical killer disease, and yet there's all these exceptions, and there's all these ways in which people don't think of it that way outside of our own culture. So those are things that really fascinated me. And I think there's basically, to go back to my central question, why is there so much malaria still today? I think there's 3 central issues. First is just the science. The scientific challenges that this parasite and this disease pose to us are incredible. And people are talking about my book as a social history, and it is a social history, but in my mind when I was writing it, I really thought of it as sort of the biography of this amazing creature, and it was interesting too, because all the malaria experts I met, so many of them, they're in love with this parasite. They're just, their eyes light up when they start talking about it, because it really is just remarkable. It goes through 7 different stages in its life cycle. Each of those stages are they don't just look different, and they look completely different, but they're different in physiology. So it's a total shapeshifter. And that makes it a moving target for any kind of drugs or vaccines that we want to throw at it too. It lives in 2 different creatures. So half of its life is in the mosquito, half of its life is in whatever blood-filled host it can get its tentacles into, whether it's us or birds or whatever. And we're fighting it. So this creature is surviving for all this time, changing into all these different ways, and living completely under fire. The mosquito doesn't want it in its body. The mosquito is constantly bombarding it with its immune response. And most mosquitoes actually are successful and don't carry malaria because they fight it off successfully. There's only a handful of mosquito species that actually do transmit most of the world's malaria because they probably have kind of a tepid immune response. But so the mosquito's fighting it off, and then we're fighting it off the whole time too. And yet this parasite has been able to survive, and not only that, to thrive. Every attack that we throw at it, it can come back with an even greater sort of counterattack. In part because it's a resilient, robust little ecosystem, the malaria ecosystem. It's the mosquito, the human host, and the parasite are all kind of locked in together, this triangle. And so it's a very robust system. We can throw chemicals at it, but our chemicals don't change. Our chemicals, we have one chemical, we throw it at it, right? And these are living systems. They can adapt much faster than our chemicals can change. And they can adapt faster than our bodies can change too. So the malaria system has a huge edge on us, scientifically speaking. And this is why, despite searching for a vaccine for many, many decades, and we have a huge push going on right now in the work for a malaria vaccine, still the most advanced malaria vaccine today is 30% effective at preventing infection, which is not nothing. It's great, but still, you think about vaccines that we give our kids at birth and when they're little kids. It's nowhere near what we need. Because it's just such an incredible scientific challenge, this parasite. So that's one big reason why we still have so much malaria in the world today. But the other big reason, in my mind, is just the challenge of poverty. We're talking, malaria once ranged really widely across the globe. It started in Africa, but it was there at the founding of the Roman Empire, spread right up into England and northern Europe in medieval times. Carthage was infected by the time of Christ. Probably about 4 popes died of malaria in the medieval Italy. Came over to the New World, was present all up and down the northeast coast. Really right up into Massachusetts, the Berkshire Mountains. There's historical accounts of malaria episodes there, malaria outbreaks there, all up and down the Potomac River just here. George Washington suffered malaria. There's a lot of malaria in this country after the Civil War because the South was particularly infected with malaria, and returning soldiers brought the parasite with them to all different parts of the country, which suffered all kinds of malaria outbreaks. And we brought the worst kind of malaria over into the New World when we started bringing African slaves to our land. The African strain of malaria is probably the most virulent kind, falciparum malaria. And we brought that over. We brought that over with the slave trade, and it stayed. We had falciparum malaria in this country in the South up until like the 1930s, and sporadically even after that. So it was once wide-ranging, but today really malaria has become a disease of poverty. And I visited a lot of places that are thick with malaria today, and these are places where it's not just there's sporadic electricity. There's no electricity. There's no water. There's not even furniture. And what struck me, I'll just tell you about one reporting trip I did to Malawi, where I stayed in Blantyre for a long while. And Blantyre is like, it's a modern city, you know. There's poverty, but there's roads and there's buildings and there's cars and there's air conditioning and electricity and all the rest of it. So people really don't even take any prophylaxis there. Even when malaria doctors go visit and work in Blantyre, they don't take any malaria prophylaxis, which I think I was just amazed. I mean, I was putting on DEET as soon as I got off the plane, you know. But people in parts of Malawi get 170 bites from infected mosquitoes every year. So it's huge amounts of malaria going around. But you just go maybe an hour outside of Blantyre, down the hill into the river valleys there, and there's just sprawling villages after villages after villages, and there's just cornfields and dirt paths and tons of people. And they're living in, you know, everything's handmade. I mean, handmade mud huts, handmade granaries. They have a few tools to grow their corn. But really just incredibly rudimentary conditions. And you can see with the mosquitoes breeding all around them. The Shiri River, which is at the bottom, just outside Blantyre, it used to be a quite deep river back in David Livingstone's days. He went down that river too. But now, because of deforestation and erosion, this river is now more like that. So it's opened out a lot, and so there's routine flooding, and it means that all these villagers who live near this river, and they use the river. The river is their livelihood, so they have to live near the river. Are subject to frequent flooding. So there's standing water all over the place, and this is prime breeding ground for malarial mosquitoes. But people there, you know, if they needed to go see a doctor. I mean, I didn't see any evidence of any vehicles or cash or anything like that. There was one guy I met with a bike. So it would be difficult. You could maybe travel an hour or two to a district office, like a local clinic. And I saw some of those clinics. I mean, literally, my medicine cabinet at home has more drugs than some of these clinics do. And although there's tons of well-meaning staff, no doctors. I mean, the one clinic that I'll never forget, we lined up all the staff outside the clinic, and it was huge. I mean, there must have been like 20 people in this little 2-room clinic, this tiny little medicine cabinet and 2 beds. And the most advanced training that anyone had was one guy who was learning to be a pharmacist. That was the top sort of expertise, medical expertise at that clinic, and that was specifically a malaria clinic too. So the challenge of poverty is huge, I think. And those are, you know, we talk about sort of poverty in Africa as it's this faraway thing, but I was really struck when I went back to Panama. I went to the scene of an outbreak of drug-resistant malaria, chloroquine-resistant falciparum malaria, and falciparum, of course, is the most dangerous kind of malaria. Well, that actually emerged right outside the Panama Canal just a few years ago in an outbreak in this village that you would never even know existed.